My story is a story of a lot of dispelled myths based on information that has come out over the years. I was My records say that I was born January 2nd, 1974. That is an estimate because no one actually knows when or where I was born. And I was in the Holt records, it says that I was left on the doorstep of a man's house in Wonju, South Korea, and his name is Kim Jong Kwan, and there was an address given, but the address had a missing piece to it, so it wasn't easily found. Um, so as a child, I always knew I was adopted. It was always in our family's vocabulary. It was always in the lexicon. Sometimes people ask me, when did you first know you were adopted? And there was no defining aha moment because it was always talked about. My parents read me books about Korea. They sent me to Korean day camp. But even trying to introduce those cultural elements, it's very hard for a kid to feel connected to or attached to a culture that they're not participating in an organic way. So they could have said, we're going to teach our daughter about Polish culture, and I would have gone, oh, that's interesting, okay, right? But I, as a child, didn't feel some deep emotional or satisfying connection to anything Korean. I knew that intellectually I was Korean, but it had no resonance for me. And one really profound moment was when I was 8 years old. I started to question. So my knowledge of my narrative was always I grew in someone else's stomach when I was not. Was in a foster home when I was 9.5 months old. I flew on an airplane from Seoul to New York City, and I grew up on the eastern end of Long Island, and that was satisfying enough to me until I was about 8. And then when I was 8, I started to think about other people's births and information that other people had. Like they knew what hospital they were born in, and they knew how much they weighed. And they had this information that all of a sudden I started to go, huh. So I asked my mother whether or not I was born in a hospital. And she said, probably not, but we don't know. And I said, well, what do you mean you don't know? And she explained at that time when I was 8 years old that I had been left on a man's doorstep. And I burst into tears and had this epic meltdown, which was not characteristic of me as a child. And it was this profound sense of abandonment, of mourning, and shock. Because, I don't know when and how you introduce that idea to a young child, but basically, I had that tight little narrative of you grew in someone else's stomach, she couldn't take care of you, you came to America, but those missing fibers of, wait a second, I was probably not born in a hospital, I was left on a man's doorstep. It was traumatic, and I remember it. And I think it was probably traumatic for my mother, too, to have to tell me that. But one of the weirdest things about my adoption story, as it relates, I think, to some other aspects of my life, is that I'm a journalist. I've always been very curious. I dig out information for a living. And I could not bring myself to read my adoption records for all of my 20s. I glanced at them once, and it was like opening up something you're not supposed to see, and I snapped them shut again and did not look at them again until I decided to go back to Korea for the first time. And then I said, you've got to face the music. You've got to look at your records. You have to read the information. But this is so anathema to how I behave in every other aspect of my professional life, where I read every document, I pore over, court records, I scour people's lives, but I could not face looking at my own life. And frankly, there wasn't that much available to look at anyway. So, it wasn't like I had to plow through, reams of paper. It was a very slim file. And it didn't offer very much information except for the fact that I was found on January 5th, 1974, in front of Mr. Kim Jong Kwan's house. And there was this address, and that was really it. And then I went back to Korea for the first time in 2010 on a Holt adult adoptee trip. And that was a major milestone in my adoption journey, because another thing that was sort of anathema to how I behave in the rest of my life, I've traveled a decent amount around the world. I'd gone to South America and Europe many times. I've been to East Africa. And I started to realize it's kind of weird that I've never gone to Korea. It's kind of weird that I've somehow made it my business to go to Bolivia and to Kenya, but I have not managed to get my act together to buy a plane ticket and go to the country that I'm from. And as I got older, I was like, it's getting weirder. Like, I still haven't been to Korea. And a little light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, yeah, it's time. It's time that I go back to Korea. I have to stop avoiding it. And now I have the time, I have the resources. So it seemed like I had kind of come to the end of the road of, avoiding it. I had come to the end of the road of avoiding going to Korea. So when I went back in July of 2010, I went through a post-adoption services record review, and it was deeply unsatisfying because the one thing that I had wanted, let me back up. When you're abandoned in a public place and there's no record, there's no identifying information, my birth mother or father, nobody left a note, or some mothers would pin their child's birth date to their coat or something and try to just leave a little crumb. So I had no crumbs. So when you have no crumbs, I think I've always had very low expectations in thinking that I could find any biological family. So my expectations were such that they really shifted, and I thought, okay, what's the most I could reasonably expect or ask for? And for me, I thought I would love to meet my foster mother, because that's a real person. There's a real record that she took care of me, and she may or may not remember me because it's been almost 40 years. But that would be meaningful to me because she actually cared for me at a very critical time in my life. So, and the other thing that I really wanted to find was either Mr. Kim Jong-kwon or the location where I was left. On my very first trip back to Korea, I was told that my foster mother had severed her ties with Holt, well over 40 years ago, and there was no record, and she had moved, and it wasn't something that people seemed particularly determined to find out. And when I went back to Wonju, to my hometown, because of the changed system of Korean addresses and mapping, I was not able to locate the location. The best I could do was sort of walk around the neighborhood where I was found. And it was very emotional and difficult to go back to Wonju. And in the subsequent 2 visits I've made back to Wonju, it has continued to be painful and difficult. When I am in Seoul, I feel like a tourist. I feel like I'm visiting a city that has increasingly become a little bit more familiar to me. I'm very comfortable there. I am not under the impression that I, can assimilate or blend in any real way, but I'm comfortable, and it's not a huge emotional sort of tax on me to go to Seoul. There's something about taking that train from Seoul to Wonju, or the bus, and it's like my heart starts to just get really heavy, and I get really fragile, and it's one of the hardest trips that I take when I go back to Korea. And when I think it's hard because it is a place that exists and existed back when I was born. It will always be there, but I have to always constantly renegotiate with myself and remind myself that I'm not going to get the answers that ultimately to some really key events in my life that started there. So that place is there. At some point in time, somebody had those answers. highly unlikely that I will ever get those answers. So every time I go there, it's it takes a lot out of me. It's very emotionally draining. In 2013, I had the opportunity to go to Korea for a conference unrelated to adoption, but a Korean television network approached me and asked me if they could basically tell my story and sort of follow me around Korea. And I declined several times because I just didn't really, it was not an appealing thought to me to have a camera crew walking around and trailing me. And then I thought, because I have no sort of bureaucratic, easy means to try to search for my birth family, I thought maybe there's a little chance, that they might see it. And even though, the last time anyone from my birth family would have seen me would have been 40 years ago, I thought, maybe I look like somebody now in the family, and there's always a little chance, but I didn't pin too much onto it. I thought it's kind of like a crapshoot. It's a roll of the dice. But as a life experience, it could be valuable. It could be interesting. I finally agreed to the television piece about my life, and with mixed feelings, but decided that it would be an interesting life experience. Where it got interesting was that the producers said to me, they pulled me aside one night and they said, "Heather, we have something to ask you. We have a favor to ask." And I said, "What's your favor?" And they said, "We really need to go to Wonju with you. We really need you to get some footage of you in your hometown. And if we arrange it and, do everything, will you do it?" And as I previously said, going to Wonju is a very hard, tough journey for me. And the thought of doing it with a camera crew wasn't making it more appealing. I placed a condition on it. I said, if I can bring my friend and my interpreter, Jihi U, who works with adoptees and who I trust very much, I would do it. So we took a train to Wonju. We met with the district office where they tried to better identify possibly where Mr. Kim Jong-kwan's house was. And everybody had consistently said every time we'd been to Korea that I had been to Korea. Every time that I had been to Korea, people had consistently said, "You need to ask old people. You need to ask old people who lived in this neighborhood back when the mapping system was what it was, and maybe they knew Mr. Kim Jong-kwan." I just remembered something. When I was in Korea in 2011 with my parents, we got the police department to drive us through the neighborhood where it was believed that I had been left. And the translator that we had at the time, she was very young, and she was having a very in-depth conversation with the police officer who was driving me and my parents. And I was urging her to tell me what he was saying, and she didn't want to tell me. And I pushed her, and she said, her face got very sullen, and she looked down and she said, "He's saying that this used to be back in the day the red light district, and it's quite possible your mom," and I said, "was a prostitute?" And she said, "Yes, bar worker was the euphemism." And I had a moment that I'm not proud of, but if I'm telling the truth, I started to cry, and my mom tried to comfort me, and I kind of snapped at her. And because I felt like nobody could understand that moment that I was in at that time. And it's not as if I had never given any thought to the idea that my biological mother possibly was a prostitute. It absolutely had crossed my mind, but to hear it spoken by a third party, to hear it come out of somebody else's mouth, it just sort of landed on me like a bag of rocks. I just was sort of felled by it. And it's, I still can't exactly pinpoint my finger on why that feels devastating to me, but it does, because the bottom line is, whether my mother was a bar worker or a banker or a student or, a pharmacist, whatever lot she had in life, she still carried me for 9 months and chose to let me live and chose to relinquish me and gave me, in so doing, an opportunity to have a better, richer, fuller life. So whatever was going on for her, her choice led to really, unbelievably fortunate things for me. So then I kind of went through this whole other sort of set of mental gymnastics of, well, if she was a prostitute, does it really matter? How much does that matter? And why does it matter? And why is it so upsetting to you, Heather? And I kind of beat myself up over it. And I don't have a great answer. I don't know. I don't know if it's because we all sort of, in the true American psyche of being aspirational, we all want to believe we maybe came from something a little bit more impressive. I don't know. It's not a status thing. It's just, I think that there's a sadness there because, obviously the plight of somebody who's in that line of work is not great and difficult and probably dangerous and painful. So I think that there's an element of sadness of thinking that that's what my biological mother might have endured. But hearing it come out of somebody else's mouth, it really hit me hard. And we met with the sort of unofficial mayor of the district of Wanju that I'm from, the kind of elder statesman at his little restaurant. And he just said, I remember one time in the early 70s, there was a story going around about a baby girl who had been found on the doorstep. But frankly, it was over 30 years ago, and that's all I remember. And we said, well, did that happen frequently back then? Were there lots of babies who were left? He said, no, it was just this one time. So it made us think, well, it's quite possible that I was that little baby. So that was during my 2011 trip. And when I went in 2013, we walked back down that same street where where we met with the gentleman who told me about this baby being found. And Jihi and the producers would stop elderly people on the street with the camera rolling and say, excuse me, we're wondering if you've ever encountered a man named Mr. Kim Jong-kwan in this district. And they would essentially give a very quick synopsis of who I was and why we were there. And people were incredibly hospitable and stopped what they were doing and really gave thought to it and would pause and think, is there anybody I know who might know something? And in the documentary, it's captured on film, Jihi sees a very elderly woman who's pulling a cart, and she runs up to her, and you can hear her shoes clicking on the pavement. And she stops her and says, excuse me, ma'am, and she again makes the ask, is there any knowledge that you have of a man named Mr. Kim Jong-kwan? And the woman says, he was my next door neighbor for close to 50 years. He's dead now. And she said, well, Heather is an adoptee who in her record says she was left in front of his house. Can you take us there? And she did. And it was about a 3-minute walk from the street that we had been on a couple of times. And so in that moment, we're walking there and my heart is pounding and I'm thinking, this is it. This is the thing I've always wanted. I've always wanted to find the place where I was found. Here we are, and the camera's rolling and we're walking there. And, in the single most unexpected emotional experience of my life, I had the rug pulled out from underneath me, because in my mind, like anybody who sets out with a goal or a mission to find something out or to acquire something, in my mind's eye, I thought, when I find that place where I was left as a newborn infant around when I find that place where I was left as a newborn on January 5th, 1974, it's going to be like this triumphant moment, this revelatory moment. I'm going to feel so satisfied, so happy. I finally found the place that I was left at. This is what I've always wanted. I mean, my bar was so low. Most people want to meet their biological family. I just want to stand at that spot and have a moment to myself that this is where it all started, and that will be good enough for me. And I thought I would feel so triumphant and like I reached my goal. And I got there and I just broke into tears. I was a mess. And I was just, it was devastating. It was not a celebratory moment. It was not a triumphant moment. Any satisfaction about having found the place was completely usurped by this, tidal wave of grief and pain and one of the most profoundly lonely moments I've ever had in my entire life. And I, in my mind's eye, as we're standing in front of this man's house, what I saw was a little baby, 3 days old, in the cold weather, on a winter's day, sitting on the doorstep by herself. And for me, it was so hard and so lonely and sad. And even though I have so much to show for myself now and many things in my life that I feel very proud of and grateful for, none of that mattered in that moment. None of it. It didn't matter that I grew up to be a healthy person with a loving family and a good education and a good job. None of that mattered. All that mattered in that moment was that this is how my life started, alone, on the doorstep at 3 days old. And I just saw this fragility and this, I saw this this real sense of, I am really alone in this world. And I really started out very much alone in this world. And so it was the most unexpected response that I could have imagined, having found something that in my mind was going to be something that would be so incredibly satisfying and happy to finally, connect with. And in fact, I was completely taken under by it. And it's all in this documentary. So, all of Korea got to see me weeping at the doorstep. So while I was in Korea after the television documentary aired, I became scared that somebody might come forward and say that they were my biological family. What I learned about myself was I thought, you put yourself out there. Obviously that's a possibility, but I'm not ready for that at this moment in time. I needed a little buffer time. I thought I would rather hear a month from now or 2 months from now that somebody saw it and thinks that they are somehow related to me. I didn't want it to happen the next week. I wasn't emotionally braced for that. And I did let myself wish a little bit that somebody would get in touch. I let myself think, wow, that could really be crazy and interesting if someone saw the piece on me on television and stepped forward and said that they were a relative of mine. And it didn't happen. Nobody ever came forward. Nobody else ever called the television station. I had a woman here in New York City on 58th Street stop me because the television documentary was playing in her Korean dentist's office here in New York City. And she said, "Oh my God, are you Heather?" And I said, yes. And she said, I saw your story at the dentist's office. I haven't found it deeply unsatisfying to grow up without a connection to my birth family. I think about them. I wonder from time to time, but I have not been somebody who felt that I had a gaping hole in my heart or a gaping hole in my life because of their absence. So to me, the thought of ever reconnecting with them fell into the category of a real bonus. I know that there are lots of reunion stories that go south and that doesn't go well. So it could potentially be a landmine, but it wasn't something that I thought, oh my God, if I don't find my birth family, I'm going to go to my grave this incomplete human being. So for me, I, I think it was really important though to go through the emotional steps of realizing that there could be value to it, there could not be value to it, but it's important to connect with the desire to want to know something, as opposed to going through your entire life not being curious about who you are. I think that in the end, for me, could have or would have been detrimental. How can somebody who is deeply curious by nature, makes a living digging up things about other people's lives and information, how could I not turn that curiosity on myself? That's crazy. So I think that it was really important that it happened in an organic way. It didn't happen until my late 30s, but that I actually went through this emotional process where I connected with the desire to want to know something about myself and had to then face the music at all these different milestones in terms of, what does it mean if I actually get there? What does it mean if I find something? How am I going to take it if I find nothing? How am I going to feel if I'm just one of those adoptees who never finds my biological family, which is the most likely outcome? And I feel more whole and more complete and more happy. I feel for having gone through the steps and having gone through the desire. I made those 3 trips to Korea. I got a little something out of each trip, and that for me, that was good enough. So I had a milestone birthday. I turned 40 years old, and that was not without its bumps and bruises. And it's been a very eventful year. I got married last year, and I'm now about 5 weeks away from having my first child, a little girl. And I work as a producer for CBS. And much to my surprise, I married an Asian American man. I married a Japanese American man. And that had been something that I could never have anticipated happening. It's not something I pursued because in terms of my racial identity, for the vast majority of my life, I felt white. I intellectually knew I was not white. If someone asked me, it's not like I said I was white. But in terms of my emotional and intellectual composition, I had like white brain. I had like white brain, white innards. And so I didn't naturally connect to, Asian Americans who were not adopted, because I did not have a shared culture. I did not have shared language. I did not have the experience of growing up in an Asian American household with Asian American parents. So there wasn't enough connective tissue there for me to gravitate to those people. And so because many people, I've been asked many times over the course of my life whether I would have considered marrying or dating an Asian man. And I said, it's not that I'm discriminating against Asian men, but unless they're adopted, they don't really get me. And I don't, and I would be lying if I say I totally got them, because we didn't have parallel existences growing up. And I grew up white and they grew up Asian. So it's not a natural gravitational pull there. So nobody is more surprised than I am that I have an Asian American husband. And it's interesting because sometimes we ask each other, we talk about it. It's like, do do you think of yourself as do you look at me and see me as being Asian? And it's like, no, not really. But then sometimes I'll look at him and I'll think, wow, like people see us now and like we're an Asian couple. We are an Asian couple. That's weird. Like, because I grew up feeling white and now I'm part of this, and we're going to have an Asian family. He's always had an Asian family. I have not. So, and then prior to our wedding, my mother said something really cute and sort of funny. She said to Kevin, to my husband, just so we're clear here, does your family know that we're white? And that Heather's adopted and that we're white? They're not expecting Asian parents to show up, right? And he said, no, they know. So, and I just think that culturally, one of my great challenges as a mom is how to introduce, I definitely want my daughter to grow up with a sense of being Korean, but I also want her to grow up with a sense of being Italian because that's how I grew up. That's the truth. That's the reveal, which is that I grew up in this Italian American household, and those are the traditions that are natural and organic to me. The Korean stuff, frankly, is more of it's an effort and it's not organic. It's not natural because I didn't grow up doing those things. I didn't grow up doing Korean holidays. I didn't grow up wearing, any traditional Korean dress or eating Korean meals on a regular basis. So if I'm going to want my daughter to have that, that's effort on my part. That takes some engineering. Whereas if I said, I just want her to grow up the way I grew up, well, then she's going to grow up eating antipasta and, lots of loud, vociferous, family dinners. So, and sometimes I've questioned myself as like, is that like just inauthentic and sort of, am I faking it for her benefit? But she's always going to be perceived as an Asian American woman. So she may as well have some of the cultural references and some, I want her to be more attached to her Asian identity than I was. And I think there's the potential for her to be more attached to it because she will have Asian parents. So it could be less of a reach for her. So that's something that we talk about and we think about. The one thing that came up at dinner the other night that I just wanted to mention, something that's interesting about growing up in a white family is this idea, like, do you view your parents as white? Do you see their race or do you just see them as mom and dad? Well, for the vast majority of my life, I just saw my parents as my parents. And I wasn't really aware that as a family, visually, we look different. And it's quite obvious that I'm not their biological child. I just wasn't aware of how the outside world was really viewing us when we were out and about. But as I got older, there were a couple of occasions where I was concerned that people thought that I was my father's girlfriend. And then when I would go out with white boyfriends and my parents for dinner, I realized that people thought that the boyfriend was their son and I was the outside person, that they were the family because they were all white. And I thought, that's really weird. And that's totally not true and not accurate. And so sort of in my 20s, I would say I did start viewing my parents distinctly as, my parents are white, I am not. And even though this is not new and this is not a surprise, I've always known this, but I see it now. I can step outside of the situation and look at it and say, oh, the rest of the world makes a whole different set of assumptions about what's going on here.